But welcome everybody who's here to the April 2021 evening program of the North Coast chapter of the California Native Plant Society. I'm Carol Ralph, currently president, and I'm only one of many valuable and talented volunteers that help our club do a lot of different things, make a lot happen. There might be some people on here who don't know what CNPS is. This is the California Native Plant Society, which is a nonprofit membership organization that brings together science, conservation, education, and horticulture to save native plants. That's what we're all about. And before we go any farther this evening, I'm going to introduce our vice president and Zoom coach, Andrea Taylor, who's just going to be sure we all know how to do Zoom things tonight.
Thank you, Carol. I just want to remind everyone to please remain muted unless you're a presenter, or at the end we'll field any questions and we can call on you if needed. You can leave your video on during the presentation, so the presenters speaking to a crowd, or you can take your video off if you need to. Also, if you have any Zoom questions, you can use the chat button. If you move the cursor to your bottom of the screen, there's the chat function, and you can message me, Andrea Taylor, if you have any Zoom finagles or quick Zoom questions. I can help you out. Also tonight, if anyone wants to share any plant observations, please use the chat function for that, and we'll look at those in a little bit to share any spectacular plants you may have seen. And I guess with that, I will hand it back to Carol.
Thank you, Andrea. And I forgot to tell you that I want to share my Yes, I Would Like list. So can you make me a co-host so that I can do that? Okay. We have what we call our Yes, I Would Like list, so that people who are not connected with our chapter, either to get notice about what we do or to volunteer with us, have a way to know what we can do. So I'm going to find this list right now. How's that look? Are you looking at it?
Yes.
Okay. So if you would like to get emails about what we're doing, then you look at, take down, or you could send us in our chat this information here, then you'll go on our group's EO and you'll get emails about our activities. Like you'd get an email about this program tonight. If you'd like to help propagate plants in our native plant nursery in freshwater, then you contact this email address. That will get you to our nursery manager. And on that subject, if you want to buy native plants, they're available daily. So every day from 12 to noon on a stand at the Neeland Glen Farm stand, which is also right there at Freshwater Farm. And if you would like to get advice about native plants for your yard, so if you're doing some landscaping and you want to know what plants would grow well there, well, you can contact Melanie. She's the coordinator of our native plant consultants, and the 2 or 3 of those of our volunteer consultants will come look at your yard and share what their thoughts with you, and you'll get ideas. Okay. And you can find out more about our organization on this website, which is especially important right now. This is an exciting time of year because traditionally the first weekend of May is the weekend of our spring wildflower show, our biggest event of the year, and simultaneously our spring native plant sale. So this year, this is the second year we're not doing the wildflower show in person. But if you go to this website and you click on the tab up at the top about that says Wildflower Show 2021, you will find the information about the show. We're still building that website, so it's not all there, but I can tell you that the first thing you're going to see is about what we call Art Share April. this entire month, the artists in Arcata area and elsewhere have fun art sharing things to do. One is there are placed around the county, well, certainly around Arcata and Eureka and Trinidad and McKinleyville, what they're calling free little wildflower art galleries, which are like little free libraries, but these are ones where you put in 3-inch square pieces of art that you have made, and you can borrow one from the box. So it's a way to share art without sharing germs like COVID. And then there's also art being shared on Facebook and Instagram. And there are Zoom evening programs by artists on Friday evenings at 7. And there's a page that's called Art Challenges, which is a list of fun activities to do, many of them aimed at kids. So you can go to the Art Share webpage and get all that. And then there's information about the virtual wildflower show, which will be taking place using iNaturalist in a variety of ways and using Zoom. So you will see that you will learn there about our iNaturalist collection and our iNaturalist wildflower walks, which are going to start being viewable this coming Saturday, April 17th. And we're pretty sure we're going to have a blitz, a wildflower blitz. And then we're also having 9 consecutive nightly Zoom sessions to talk about wildflower fun and to have a series of speakers about serpentine habitats and the plants in them. And you'll find that list there also. And then if you want to attend our plant sale, which is an in-person sale, you just have to make an appointment. And you do that by going to the plant sale tab on our website. And then there's a link there that will take you to the sign up genius place. Okay, so it's a busy time and we hope to see you at these events. Okay, now we go back to Andrea. I'll stop this. Andrea, has anybody contributed any plant observations?
Yeah, sure have. So William has seen some hound's tongue, Cynoglossum officinale. And we have a guest tonight from Missouri. They saw some beautiful Erythronium albidium, so a beautiful little fawn lily out in Missouri.
Is that Eli?
Yep. Got it.
Thanks, Eli.
Katrina seen some cobweb thistle out on the Lost Coast Trail. And then we have Sierra fawn lilies near Hoopa, growing on a rocky cliffside, Erythronium multiscapidium.
I wonder how they identified that, but this is Fawn Lily Month. It's a good time to see them, lots of different places.
Also a Trillium month. Donna's seen a Trillium extravaganza on the Hope Creek Trail near in Perry Creek.
Well,
also redwood is starting to bloom in the Trinity River watershed.
Good. So we have word from the inland part of the county. Okay, well, thank you people for sharing those flowers with us. Okay, I'm excited about tonight's program. Last month we learned about prairies.
Bandwidth is low.
Hey, Greg, you need to silence yourself.
Well, I showed up.
You too. Okay, sorry. Last month we learned about prairies.
It's a terrible time of the day to be trying to log on, but
Greg, if you could
we haven't
hear us,
had a problem.
Andrea, do you know how to mute him? I'm sure he doesn't want to be doing that. Okay, good job. Okay, so this month we're going to be talking about forests, a more widespread habitat here in the northwest corner of California, especially forests that are harvested for human use. And to introduce our speaker tonight, I'm going to pass you over to Andrea Tuttle, who is one of our local big thinkers on forest and climate change policy. So we're honored to have her here too. Okay, Andrea.
Well, thanks, Carol, and hello, everyone. It's great to see you, and thanks for joining in. I have the honor tonight to introduce Laurie Wayburn, who is your presenter. But to set the scene, I'm going to put Laurie's talk in context by also introducing you to the Pacific Forest Trust, where I've been a board member for practically 14 years now. Many of you may have heard of PFT, but you don't really have a good understanding of its mission or the unique role that it has played in driving forest policy for the past 25 years. PFT was founded by Laurie Wayburn and her partner, Connie Best, in the early 1990s to fill a new space in the world of environmental organizations that no one else was working in, namely incentivizing the conservation and good management of privately owned forests. So think of all the forest land in the United States. There's about, 740 million acres or so, and 60% of that is owned by private landowners. So we all love our wonderful state and federal parks and our wilderness areas and our national forests, but the majority of forest land is actually in private hands. So focusing on those private lands and finding incentives for landowners to promote good conservation and stewardship is where PFT focuses. So part of this means that the private landowner needs to derive some kind of economic income from the forest, because otherwise the smart thing to do is to chop it up and subdivide it into ranchettes and destroy the very forest fabric and values that we care about. So PFT has taken on 3 roles. The first is as an active land trust, like many of the land trusts that you're familiar with. Laurie and Connie long ago invented the instrument called the Working Forest Conservation Easement, which is now used by land trusts across the country to retain private forest land as forests. The second role is that PFT is a driver of cutting-edge forest policy. We work primarily in California, but also in Oregon, some in Washington, and in Washington, D.C. PFT has been instrumental in securing the role of forests in climate mitigation in California, and it now focuses on the protection and restoration of what we call source watersheds. As you all know, water doesn't come from a dam, it comes from the upstream watershed. And so we believe it is equitable for the users of the water downstream from the dam to help support the restoration and protection activities of the landscapes above the dam. And that's where one of our major policy area focuses is now. But it's the third role of PFT that Laurie is talking about tonight, and that is walking the talk. This means that PFT not only talks about forests, but we actually practice forestry and demonstrate what we propose by actively managing several thousand acres of forest land right here north of Arcata, known as the Van Eck Forest. And this demonstrates, and you'll hear from Laurie, how conservation and timber production can be integrated to rebuild and restore the environmental values of the forests that we cherish. So Laurie is a Harvard grad. She worked in Kenya for the UN. She was executive director of the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, where she met CJ Ralph long ago. But for the last 25 plus years, she has developed her own reputation and national renown for her work in founding PFT and in driving cutting edge forest policy in climate, forest carbon, land use, water, wildfire, wildlife policy that provides the incentives for these private landowners to manage their lands for the values, environmental values that we cherish. So please welcome Laurie and the topic, putting the forest back into forestry. So Laurie, the screen is yours.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm going to move over here to a screen share and hope this works. Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Andrea, for Carol and Andrea number 2 for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight, and Andrea number 1 for what a wonderful introduction. So yes, my topic is putting the forest back in forestry, because for the vast majority of people, forestry means harvesting timber or other forest products. It doesn't actually mean managing for the forest. It means managing for commodity production. And what Pacific Forest Trust is seeking to do is really complement the economic returns of sustainable forestry with real financial value for the other values of forestry, of forests. And that is because while regulations are an essential tool, regulations are usually about defining the acceptable floor of management. And in forests, we've relied on regulation to protect public trust benefits. Whether it was wildlife or climate or water, we regulate by saying no to things as opposed to providing incentives for saying yes to things and reaching for the sky. So what PFT really has focused on is that integration of economic and ecologic return, providing financial return for managing for those public benefits too. Whether it's for wildlife, where we developed the working forest conservation easement that Andrea mentioned, and we've led the conservation of about 287,000 acres at this point. We hold easements on about 110,000 acres, and we manage close to 14,000 acres. And then, as Andrea mentioned, we've been very active in the space of developing markets for the climate, not just carbon, but climate values of forests, and then the water values of forests. So the Van Eck Forest, and I think I may have, sorry, I have a new computer and I'm not as adept at the advance as I'd like to be. But the Van Eck Forest, which is what Carol wanted me to talk about tonight, really are in many respects, the proving grounds for our vision. And Fred Van Eck was a fascinating man who was involved in investing for financial return. But he was involved in investing for financial return for the long term, for many, many generations. And if you think about it, land stewardship is really for the long term too, for many generations, if you will, the 7 generations ahead, or how my many generations ahead will think of me as an ancestor. This is kind of that perspective that he had. And in meeting him, he thought, well, I wonder if we could show the synergy of managing for economic and ecologic return. And so this is the vision that guides what we're doing at the Van Eck Forest, really advancing forest conservation as the basis for all the values that we want, and that will yield not only those timber supplies, but climate adaptation, wildlife, and broader sustainability. So the Van Eck Forest is about 2,200 acres of highly productive redwood lands in 4 tracts, these 4 here, that are in the Arcata, McKinleyville area. And in addition to the talk that I'm giving this evening, we hope that when it is safe for you all to do so, we can get you out in the field with one of our forest steward associates where you can walk around on them. But we conserved this forest in 2002 with Fred Van Eck, and we have managed it since then as well. And it has been the proving grounds for our work in managing for climate benefits and managing for Endangered Species Act protections for habitat. Now, in this forest, how did we decide to set this up? Because one of the things that we know about private forest lands is that they often change hands quickly and management changes quickly. So how would you put in place a really enduring long-term management program? And this is done through this working forest conservation easement that Andrea has mentioned. And it really is a roadmap for the management of the forest. And what it uses is a simple performance goal. What do we want to see in that forest over time? And then a few restrictions about how we get there. But this is an area which is a tremendous overlap with the Native Plant Society, because in this performance goal, we are flagging that these forests are to be managed to restore the natural composition, trees and understory and herb layer, and now, thanks to Steve Sillett, also the canopy layer. And we'll get to that a little bit later. When we did this conservation easement, we didn't know about vegetation of the canopy, so we didn't flag that in our performance goal. For the structure of this forest, in other words, the range of dimensions in the horizontal as well as the vertical structure, and the age classes from 0 to 600 and how those were to be distributed, really targeting a restoration of the age classes over 200 years. So when we say long-term management, we really mean long-term. We also flag the deadwood component, the standing snags and the lying down wood, because those are such important parts of the forest. So you can see right away that this is forest management targeting what the forest looks like, not just what comes out of the forest. And then we have a minimum target volume that we want to restore. Many of you already know that the standard industrial redwood forest land has a very low stocking compared to what these forests could hold. So our minimum target is about 100,000 board foot to the acre. Most forests that you see that are managed are between 7,000 and 12,000 board foot to the acre. It's a really big difference. And then a critical issue for us is a limit on the opening sizes to more mimic what would have been natural gaps and skips in structure. At the same time, as we're doing this, we're operating annually and we are generating economic return every year, but that's a byproduct of the management. It is not the driving force of the management. So, with forests, history matters. With society at large, history matters, but it really matters in forests. And these forests are enormously productive. They were some of the largest stocking of any redwoods anywhere. So this is a photo comparison that's about a 70-year gap when these forests are starting to recover from their early management and in terms of harvest, and then the effort to turn them into pasture lands or farming lands. This here is the Squaw Creek Tract, and you can see very significant management up on the ridge there. This is the Moonstone Tract. It's the most coastal, has the most coastal influence, and that has some outcomes on it. You can see how sparse the stocking is in 48. Actually tried to grow potatoes there, which is not the highest and best use, botanically or any other way speaking. And here is the Lindsay Creek Tract. Many of you drive by this as you're going over to the Fieldbrook Valley or coming into McKinleyville. And then here is the Fieldbrook Tract. Fieldbrook is the site of the Fieldbrook giant, which was the largest tree in the world. And yet you can see that there was a very concerted effort to turn this into pasture. So the reason I show you these is because forests are always changing, and they have been recovering since this very intensive management. But this is the challenge that we were looking at. This is a photograph on the Fieldbrook Tract of an old growth stump and then the current composition. So in looking to restore this forest, what do you do? Well, one thing that you do is in addition to having really good guidance from our conservation easement, you find really good foresters on the ground to work with. And I noticed that Greg Blomstrom joined this Zoom meeting, and Greg was one of those really good foresters on the ground as part of Baldwin, Blomstrom, and Associates, Ibiwa, Wilkinson as well, that we asked to come and work with us after we had already had the management in hand for about 8 years. We realized we needed some really terrific people with the kind of forestry aesthetic and technique that we needed. And Greg's group was that. And we've been thrilled to work with them ever since. So here's the challenge. How do you bring back the forest that supported that magnificent stump? So in the beginning, you're looking at a stand like this, a lot of small stems, very crowded, nothing like the composition. Well, the composition isn't too bad, but the structure is nothing like what you want to see. And the age classes are not what you want to see. And the understory in the beginning was not what we wanted to see. So how do you work with that to get to something like this? Actually, this is an after photograph of that prior one that I just showed. And how you get there is by a very careful approach to selecting the trees that you want to take, leaving the ones that you want to keep growing, and recognizing that even as they keep growing, you will continue to take out some rather large trees over time to create more space. But what we've done here is, through spacing, removed the excess small stems and kept the larger ones. So our goal here is to consistently improve these stands by creating more light and water resources for the remaining trees so that they can really develop. And as I'll show you a little bit later, some of those trees are going to develop far more effectively than others. And in so doing, those trees will drive the overall diversity function in these stands. And that is a very exciting new phase of our work that we're getting into, actually, thanks to Steve Sillett, who may be able to answer a few questions about this as we go on in the talk. But the notion here is that we want to stay involved in these forests and restoring them, because it is the labor of lifetimes to get to the function that we want to achieve. We're not trying to go back in history and take people out of the picture. What we're trying to do is demonstrate how, by being involved with these forests, we can restore those functions, even while taking out economic return, timber for economic return. This is another view of that same kind of approach. You can see within this, there's a real dominance of larger diameter trees and really tall trees beginning to take shape here. Now, to give another sense of what we're doing, you can look at graphs. And here is just kind of the very simplified example of what's happening on the ground. And when we took these forests over, the average stocking was in the 20,000 board foot to the acre. Some were below, some were above, but more or less that. Today, the average stocking is almost 60,000 board foot to the acre, and we've been taking out on average about 1 million board feet every year. So what that means is we're actually taking out a pretty significant harvest, which does bring back some very solid financial return. But in so doing, we are actually increasing the base principle of this forest. Another way of looking at that here is that we've taken out almost 21 million board feet. As of this year, we will have, but our inventory has increased substantially. In fact, on one of the tracts, the inventory is over 70,000 board foot to the acre. So it's really beginning to approach the minimum that we have targeted. And we may have set our sights a little too low, like Joe Biden saying we'll have a million shots in everybody's arm by initially June. We set a minimum of 100,000 board foot, we might be able to get to 150,000 in my lifetime, which would be pretty cool. And another piece of this is the carbon inventory that is on the property in terms of the climate function of these forests. And as Andy mentioned, this organization really pioneered the inclusion of forests within California's climate policy, because we recognize that the loss and degradation of forests was the second largest source of CO2 emissions. And so in order to address that root cause of climate change, we wanted to include forests. And that was done through developing the offset program under the Air Resources Board. And this is the stocking of carbon that has been accreting here on this property over this same time period. And that in turn set off a huge trend across the country. I mentioned earlier that the Van Eck is really our kind of proving ground for concepts. And this was the very first carbon offset project that was done within California. And so back in 2008, that was recognized as being a really big accomplishment. It was also thought to be really weird. This was one of those things that forest landowners went, you want me to manage for what? But this was a new commodity and really creating a commodity out of thin air, if you will. And this is now in process. There are now over 4.3 million acres enrolled in California's compliance program nationwide. So what started on this little 2,200 acre property just outside of Arcata provided a very practical model for how you didn't have to just suffer if you were going to manage for broader benefits and really restoring and managing for the natural forest. You could actually make money doing that. And so this is a photograph that Steve Sillett took. And Steve, I hope it's okay, I used this. But really, in terms of this forest, it's an absolute growing legacy. Some of these trees that you can see poking out above the regular rest of the canopy are over 200 feet tall. They're still reaching for the sky. Steve has identified that some of these are accreting biomass at the fastest rate of any that he's been measuring. And this is a view from the canopy on Lindsay Creek, looking down the Fieldbrook Valley. And this is where we probably are going to need to describe the vegetative community that we want to see in the canopy as well. So that's great for the trees. What about for everybody else? And that elk is one of the species that we've caught on camera on the Van Eck. That was actually on the Squaw Creek tract. And these are some of the others. So that we're managing for the chanterelle and for the bear, as well as for this third generation or second generation of a logging family here on the Lindsay Creek tract. And loggers really enjoy coming to Van Eck because they get to both cut big trees and grow big trees and know that that will be a reliable supply. And here are some of the other creatures that use this or have used this. So the spotted owl, which is here on the upper left, is no longer to be found on a regular basis on the Van Eck Forest because of the barred owl, which has moved into the Fieldbrook Valley. But that spotted owl was the basis for another one of the Van Eck's kind of proving ground elements. One of the things that we want to do in rewarding landowners for managing for public benefit is provide them with operational certainty. And one of the kind of boogeymen that is put up in terms of the Endangered Species Act is that if you have endangered species on your property, you will get shut down from operating. So we wanted to show that that didn't need to be the case. And we took the Van Eck to the Fish and Wildlife Service as an example, saying, we are managing this forest to restore and maintain those old growth forest functions. While not, it's not going to be old growth, but we wanted to have old growth forest functions. So we want to manage for habitat for spotted owl. And indeed, we have had spotted owl on the property. At one point, we had both a male and female, but as I say, the barred owls have showed up, and so we no longer are having them. But in response to that request, the Fish and Wildlife Service looked at what we were doing and agreed to issue a safe harbor permit, a safe harbor agreement permit for us, which is effectively the ability to continue to harvest as long as what we were doing was maintaining and increasing the amount of habitat, which is what is called for under the conservation easement. So we've paired that operational certainty with the management that we have. So we know that we can just pretty much continue this ad infinitum. So a quick look at the impact of 20 years, more or less, of management. This is an aerial, a Google Earth image in 2003, and gives you a sense of the surrounding landscape, what it looked like in terms of clear cuts and development. And the Van Eck forests really do pop out as being these nice dark green areas. And in 2020, you can see that some of the forestry around it, there are a lot of the clear cuts are recovering, but one of the elements that you also see is the increase in development that is happening here. And this goes back to this issue that Andrea Tuttle was mentioning in the beginning. This drive for economic return on the part of landowners is a really critical one. And as the Arcata McKinleyville area is becoming a very attractive place for climate refugees, because it's cooler and wetter, and it's not like being in the middle of Tempe, Arizona, or down in San Diego. It's a really beautiful place to live. More development happens, and development interrupts forest function just as much as very simplifying forestry or timber harvest. And so it shows the bulwark of the Van Eck forests against development as well. So I want to go back to something that I had mentioned earlier here, and that's a synergy of managing for both increasing yields of timber and carbon stores over time, because these things are integrally linked. Fundamentally, the volume of timber can also be viewed as the volume of carbon. And the way trees grow, the way forest stands grow, there really is this pressure of the time value of money to harvest early, because people want money quickly. And so what that's doing is really cutting our nose off to spite our face, if you will, that we harvest trees just as they're beginning to really pack on the volume of timber and carbon, therefore. So what we've been doing in this is providing money to build up that principle of carbon and timber on these properties. And just simply put with that, bigger trees store more carbon. And so there's this real synergy of managing for older forests for the climate benefits that they provide and paying landowners to do that, whether it's through paying for carbon offsets or it's paying for conservation easements that drive the kind of management that we've been proving out at the Van Eck. And why I'm going to do this, and I hope that Carol Ralph will forgive me for doing this, but there is no more pressing issue in our time than climate change. And there is no more effective tool to help solve the climate crisis than working with forests to conserve them, manage them for their natural functions, and for restoring their carbon stores. The only possible way to reach the green line here, which is the safe line in terms of the impacts of excess CO2, is by engaging the power of forests. And so when you think about forests, think about them as this critical solution to climate change, just as much as you think about transportation or energy. Because managing for forests like these redwoods, which is what we're trying to get back to in an economically productive way on the Van Eck, is the most cost-effective multi-benefit option that we have in the climate crisis. So just stepping back for a second to the big view, this Van Eck vision about the elegant symmetry of conservation with commerce and climate, this has been an extraordinary story that in some senses we're only just getting to the beginning chapters of, because while we well understand what to do within the forest in terms of the standing structure of live and dead trees and the understory plant composition, this whole integration with the canopy and how that can drive biodiversity within a forest, if we are able to take this next step where we're restoring diversity into the canopy, that also has real impacts on the moisture regimes in these forests and therefore their productivity and therefore their survival under climate change as well. So with that, I'm going to stop and say thank you for your attention and hope that there are some questions about the Van Eck and what we're doing there. And I will stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Laurie. Let's see. I'm here. So, Andrea Taylor, are you looking for questions? Are you seeing the questions roll in? Laurie's ending might have caught people by surprise.
I think people are still digesting everything we just heard. I've been looking at the chat and we haven't received any questions yet.
We do have one question from Ken Burton.
Oh, just kidding.
So his question is, how does our approach compare to that of the city of Arcata vis-a-vis the Arcata City Forest? That's a great question. And probably Ken knows that Marc Andre was closely associated with Bibua when we asked Bibua to come work with us. And Dale Thornburg was Pacific Forest Trust's senior forester when we began. And of course, Dale was deeply involved in the Arcata City Forest. I'd say that the Arcata City Forest is 100 years ahead of us. There are some very strong similarities in the approach and management, but they started with a much older forest than what we have on the Van Eck in terms of the age of the trees and the composition that we had. Nobody had tried to turn the Arcata City Forest into pasture land or potato fields, which was the case for a couple of these tracts of ours. But the principles there are very similar. And in fact, the Arcata City Forest also, after Van Eck had done a carbon project, and the folks at Bibua became pretty familiar with what was entailed with those, then Arcata City Forest also entered into the carbon offset projects too.
So we also have a question from Avery. Do you think you'll ever see more spotted owls on this land? Also, are you thinking of expanding what land is protected?
Well, two great questions. So we do surveys for spotted owls every year, and we have identified transients coming through and occasional male as well. We've not had any females back on the Van Eck. And I know it's very controversial, but the issue of managing for spotted owls probably entails a very invasive approach, which is removing barred owls. And that is something that we are willing to do, but it's a very difficult process of getting a permit to do that. So we're a little hampered in that regard. So we know that they're coming through. We know that there's, let's say, a young male that has been identified a couple of times on the property, but with barred owls occupying the territory, unless those barred owls are removed, I don't think we'll have breeding spotted owls on the property. That's a really difficult choice for anybody who loves birds. We tipped the balance in favor of barred owls unintentionally. And if we are going to bring it back to spotteds, we're going to have to tip the balance intentionally. So that's to the one question. And the other question of, we are always looking to expand forest protection, particularly in a landscape like this, where there are still some really significant tracts of private forest land that are not protected, and where we can provide, in particular, connectivity for habitat and broader watershed management.
All right, so next, Mark and Melinda Bailey ask, how are you managing the forest canopy? You mentioned in the beginning that wasn't really on your radar until someone named Steve Sillett came around.
Well, that's a great question. And how we're looking to do that is we are fully embracing what I would call Steve Sellett's PET project. So that's the PET stands for potentially elite trees. And he is working with us, and actually he can certainly speak for himself, but what we want to do is take his work and identify in every harvest that we do those trees that can fit that definition of a potentially elite tree. In other words, a tree that will really quickly evolve to have the characteristics of an old growth tree and be able to support the upper canopy, vegetation, and then the functions that come from having that, in particular the polypodium, in terms of its water function, water cycle function. So he is helping us identify and teaching us how to identify in the future, because it's not only fishing, he's teaching us to fish these potentially elite trees, and then we will be marking them so that they are retained permanently. And then we will also be looking to both top them to get the kind of complex top structure that these trees can support and that we want to have, and place polypodium in them. And in fact, the first polypodium we hope are going in this year. So Steve, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything you want to say about that?
Sure, I'll chime in. Even in the biggest redwood rainforests, such as we see at Jedediah Smith and Prairie Creek, it's a small number of trees that do the bulk of the biodiversity work. It's just a few per hectare. And these potentially elite trees could be the ones that are becoming elite and have the types of crown complexity and habitat values that Laurie's speaking of. As far as disturbing them and topping them, that may or may not be necessary. And if we did have to top them to initiate the process of trunk reiteration, it wouldn't have to be a massive topping event where we take most of the crown out. It would be relatively small arborist style cuts. And the fern mats that we're talking about transplanting this fall, we've gotten a permit from Prairie Creek Redwoods to go in. We've already done this and collect freshly fallen polypodium schooleri mats from the canopy that came down in the winter storms. I thought it was going to be really difficult to do that. And Giacomo Renzullo and I went in there and filled the back of his truck up in about 2 hours. So we have plenty of material now that we're ready to transplant.
Thank you, Steve. Let's see, so Russell Kramer noticed that you were primarily thinning smaller trees. Are you also trying to leave groups of small trees to keep a diverse range of ages on the property rather just than leaving the largest trees?
It's a good question. Actually, we have plenty of small trees left with that. And in one of the photographs, we harvest trees that are over 40 inches. So we're not just taking small trees. One of the reasons I showed the photograph of one of the Sergeant and Sons loggers with his big saw, so you had a sense of that. But the size of some of the really big trees that are being taken down. One of the things that's really hard to wrap your brain around is taking down big trees to have more big trees get bigger. But it is part and parcel of what we're doing. And in fact, one of the challenges that we have, it is a challenge that you also see on the Arcata City Forest, is that if you're looking to really get back to the kind of composition where you just had a few trees in that 48 inch and above range of the 62 inches, 70, which is what redwoods certainly can do. You're looking at 6 foot, 8 foot plus diameter trees. You got to take out some of the ones that are at 4 feet to get there. And that is what we do. When we do a log sale, we consistently take out the mills that specialize in large logs. So I was focusing on that one example of Field Brook, where the really intense small stem regrowth has happened. And it's actually happened largely in spruce, because Field Brook, what happened was when they tried to turn this into pasture, they burned that area several times trying to get rid of those persistent redwood stumps. And they did get rid of some of them, to the degree that when the pasture lands were abandoned, it's the spruce seed that blew in, and we got a heavy, heavy spruce component. So there's a ton of small spruce stems that we are clearing out within that. So we're really not focused on taking only small trees, but it really depends on what the stand looks like and how we can keep increasing the diameter to a more natural range of sizes. And so I hope that gives a sense. But the conservation easement mandates that we'll have trees in the 0 to 100 class at about 25%, in the 101 to 200-year-old class in the 50%, and the over 200 to 600-year class in the 25%. Now, obviously, that's going to happen when I'm long and gone, which is why having a perpetual conservation easement guiding this management is so important. But that is approaching a more natural age composition than what we see today, where private forests are absolutely dominated by the 100 and under class. Like 95% of private forests are under 100 or even under 60. So that hope that gives a sense of that.
Carol, would you like to ask your question?
Your aerial photos of Field Brook and McKinleyville creeping in on the Van Eck Forest brought to mind the question of how big a forest, how many acres of forest do you need to be able to do what you're doing meaningfully? And I noticed somebody else was wondering the same thing. If you're an owner and you have a 1 acre forest, can you do this same kind of thing?
You can absolutely do the same kind of management, but it'll have a different financial profile. It's a little bit like when you have to rent a small apartment and you pay a really high price per square foot, as opposed to a larger apartment, which is going to cost more money, but the price per square foot goes down. Managing in a really small property is going to cost more on a per acre basis than it may on a larger property on a per acre basis. So you can absolutely take this approach in any size forest. So, when we were developing the conservation easement for the Van Eck, we looked at the descriptions of what natural forests were, relatively natural forests, by looking at the composition in Redwood National Park and in Prairie Creek, saying how many trees to the acre are here? What is the composition? What are the age classes? What does the understory look like? And we literally came up with a performance goal description And I'll share just the opening of it because I look back at it and I find it to be compelling. A mix of dominant tree species, including redwood, Sequoia sempervirens. I promised I wouldn't use Latin, but I'll do it here. Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menziesii, grand fir, western hemlock, Sitka spruce, and to a lesser extent, western red cedar, with associated species including tan oak, red alder, big leaf maple, vine maple. But then identifying that redwood would be over 75% of the composition. But if you want to take something like that within your acre, you want to try and have that kind of diversity. So looking to what that relatively natural habitat would have in terms of that diversity. And then we, describe how it would change over time. And we described what the understory would look like and what the herb layer would look like. So taking those plant lists that came from these relatively undisturbed forest types and saying that's what we're managing for. So you can do that on any scale. You can't necessarily get all the diversity because you may not have the space, but you can certainly frame that as your goal and target. And there was a question that, can you do this for carbon? Somebody is not interested in the carbon market, but can you do that in terms of restoring more natural carbon loads? And again, the answer is absolutely. And one of the key principles to take away, I would hope, is that in looking at climate change is nothing if not stress or the exacerbation of existing stress. And stress on natural systems, those systems that are most resilient and resistant to stress are those that are the most natural. And so managing for those natural characteristics has a very powerful climate adaptation value. They also tend to be much more carbon rich. And so that's something that you can do at any scale within land that you have.
All right, so the next question is about the understory. I know you just discussed Prairie Creek and related plants, but are you transplanting or planting or seeding or just allowing for the natural existing seed bank and volunteers for the herbs and forbs?
We've actually been quite lucky with that in terms of just working with the seed bank that we have and the vegetation layer that we have. With the exception of our efforts to eradicate pampas grass, where that's the never-ending battle of that invasive. The only place that we are actually actively transplanting is in the polypodium and the canopy with that. One thing I will mention is we have an agreement with the Humboldt Bay Mycological Society. They come and do surveys on a couple of our tracks annually. And that's one of the key things for us is that, as you all know, the root layer is incredibly important, right? It's a communication system. It's a system for sharing energy and for fighting disease. And it's an extraordinarily important part of the forest that is not normally taken into account in timber harvest oriented forest management. So we looked at the mushroom community as a way to be an indicator of our soil health and productivity. And we don't have the diversity of Redwood National Park, but we're not too bad with what we've gotten. In terms of other native plants, we haven't really had that kind of surveys, but it's the kind of thing that we would be very open to doing and identifying if there are other areas where we should be more actively trying to encourage a more diverse native suite. But by and large, of our performance goal, we have a decent representation of both species and structure there.
Randall, would you like to ask your question about land conversion?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. The area that you're describing, the Humboldt area and the forest is terrific. It's located, however, physically located in an area, climate and soil that's ideal for reforestation, an effort. Are there any programs or groups you're aware of that are trying to help farmers or people with soil on the fringes or areas on fringes that may not be ideal to expand a forest into? I'm thinking of farmers who have traditionally used meadows and grasses and cattle. And are there any programs to help them expand this type of forest recovery or growth, to have them shift out of cattle into forest management?
So let me ask a clarifying question, Randall, first. Is the assumption here that these are lands that were forest and then were converted to grasslands, or that these are grasslands that are currently being managed for cattle?
Like I said, that's a great point. I guess maybe I'd enjoy an answer to both. If in the instance where there was originally forest, it had been cleared and it's trying to come back, or areas that you'll see a decrease in elevation and you'll see the forest change as you go down in elevation, and in those border and fringe areas, is there any, I'm not aware of anything for someone who has either a cattle operation or a crop orientation to the use of their land to consider, gee, could I put some of my land into forest, for one reason or another?
So a couple of thoughts there. I would really urge you to think about reforestation only on forest soil, land that has been forest, because in looking at this, we're really managing for a suite of values, not just, for example, carbon that you might have. Yes, more carbon in a forest than you will in a grasslands, but a grassland has its own function, its own suite of biodiversity, and the issue of converting those lands to just being a plantation of forest for their carbon values is actually going to be detrimental to their biodiversity values. And that's something we've seen repeatedly all over the world. But in terms of having an incentive for reforesting former forest lands that are out of forest, that is actually one of the really interesting areas of forest carbon offsets under California's compliance program. And in terms of paying landowners to do that, that reforestation offset type is one that has a lot of value over time for landowners. It starts small because, as we know, when you plant a tree, it's small and carbon is accreted on the outside of that tree, and it takes a while to absorb more carbon, but it will, I'm actually aware of quite a few forest companies that have done reforestation offset projects because it helps pay for that time value of money to bring a forest back. Now, in addition to that, there are quite a few programs now with the USDA for helping landowners manage for restoring both more carbon into the soil agriculturally and more biodiversity at the same time. So there are a number of Department of Agriculture programs out of NRCS in particular, and I can probably send an email to Carol with some more information on that. But that's a really growing area of governmental incentive programs in terms of on-farm practices. There are also some agricultural offsets for on-farm practices that can help pay for that kind of management that will enhance carbon stores on grasslands within a natural context.
Thank you.
Having worked in Uruguay, which is naturally a pampa, and in the early days of people thinking about climate, the goal was, hey, let's turn the pampa into eucalyptus forests, or let's grow Monterey pine here, and just enormously destructive and unsustainable conversion of those lands, because growing forests where they don't grow takes a lot of water and energy, often fertilizers. So it actually is a net loss, because to disturb those native grasslands means plowing up the soils, releases that soil carbon. Usually the native grasses have much bigger root mats. So it's not something that I feel passionate about, but I do feel passionate about it. We should be working with those natural systems.
Thanks.
Laurie, the next question's from Molly asking, is this management style only for redwood forest systems, or could it be applied to other types of temperate forests?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, there is a companion Van Eck Forest in Oregon, about 7,200 acres, that we are managing for these same values. It had a much harder history. That ownership has had a much more difficult history. When we took on its management, almost 90% of that property was under 20 years of age and single species. So it was absolutely an abuse of the extraordinarily productive coastal Doug fir hemlock forests of the Oregon's coast. And so a much more difficult starting space than where we had even here in California. And one example of that is that Swiss needlecast, which is a naturally occurring pathogen, spreads like crazy in these overstocked Douglas fir plantations. And so the most coastal portions of this are heavily infested with Swiss needlecast. Industry's way of dealing with that is to cut down those young forests and then replant them again. Then we didn't want to do that, knowing that this is a naturally occurring pathogen. If the forest was in a naturally healthy state, it would be able to fight that. So we have focused on, again, in this case, similar to an earlier question, in this case, we really are focused on taking out little trees because that's all we have. And so restoring that compositional difference has taken a lot more replanting. So we've brought in cedars, hemlock, because there's very little seed source. Across the board, we've had to bring in, and then really favoring hardwoods where they remain, in particular big leaf maple and alder, and creating more gaps and openings. So we're using, in that case, more variable retention approaches, which is like, it's like selection forestry on a slightly larger scale, where it might be 5 to 10 acres of selection, leaving groups of trees, as opposed to just single tree selection. And we're having to do a lot more in terms of creating more dead material in that forest. But the basic principles are there, and we've been somewhat fortunate in Oregon that Oregon has a much better chip and biomass utilization in terms of what we can sell there. And they really shifted to small log harvest. So we do a lot of what we call chip and saw harvest, which is small logs and then selling the rest as chip. One of the really interesting things that I think we want to recognize is in taking out all the big trees, our large log mills really had a dearth of large logs to work with, and they really started shifting to smaller diameter materials. Well, one of the interesting things, of course, is that it doesn't take much time to grow smaller diameter materials. It takes a long time to grow big ones. And so the mills have shifted to taking smaller diameter and frankly, fiber and pellet-based material. And then that becomes what people manage for. So it's a self-reinforcing cycle if you're managing for economic return. In California, we've seen a reopening of larger log mills because, thanks in part to the Forest Practice Act, there are larger logs that are more dependable supply. And so compared to Oregon, we actually have more larger log mills than they do. So a question for us in Oregon is, we're managing for large logs, and at a certain point, we hope that others are too, so that the mill capacity to take those large logs will be there. But that's a question in the future more than for today. You can also do this management in mixed conifer forests, and we're doing that in forests over near Mount Shasta. We manage a forest just outside of the town of McLeod, where we're doing the same kind of approach. The silviculture, the individual tree management will differ, but the principles are exactly the same. So managing to restore that more natural forest composition, structure, range of age classes, and doing it compatibly with the desired economic return, or some economic return there. And that has big water benefits, habitat, and carbon benefits.
Participant Richard has had his hand raised for a bit. Would you like to unmute and ask your question, Richard? Geinger might put your name. Sorry.
I think I did it. Can you hear me now? Did you unmute me? I'm unmuted here. Can you hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah, Laurie, okay. What I asked was, how do we get the Forest Management Task Force, Cal Fire et al. To get with the standards you described? The model of 35-acre clear cuts every 45 years and biomass plants for increased thinning, claiming all CO2 produced piped into subterranean geology seems to be the push. And followed up by, do you have any comments on the current Jackson demonstration of state forest cutting issue, where it seems like the largest trees are being taken in a slew of harvest plans?
Well, Richard, I hope I caught that. Your voice was a little bit distorted, but the question, I think,
It's written down.
okay. But I think the first part of
It's written
that
on the
was,
chat.
is there a way to get the state policy and regulatory apparatus to adopt what we're doing as kind of the standard and regulation? And what I'm pleased and proud to say is that the approach we take to conservation easements, the standards in these easements that the state will fund, has been adopted as the standard, at least by the Wildlife Conservation Board. So when they look at putting public money into conserving private lands with a conservation easement, they want to see standards like what we have promulgated. When we started, basically the conservation easement approach was simply buy down the development and subdivision rights and leave it at that. The landowner can manage any way they want as long as it's legal. Now, if they're going to do those conservation easements, they have to have standards like what we are articulating. That they're not going to be precisely the same, but they're going to be like, they're going to have that flavor. In terms of that being a directive for the Forest Management Task Force, I would say I'm actually very impressed with what Patrick Wright has done. If you look at that 100 actions in the action plan that was announced, there's a lot of stuff in there that I wouldn't necessarily think we needed to support, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there too. And anytime you do a state document, you're going to have a spectrum of things, but I think that the direction of that plan is really good. And I think that when we look at the fact that we're getting significant new investment by the state in forest management under the rubric of fire, but when you look at what they'll actually fund, I think it is more than just thinning. That said, I have to agree with you that it is very difficult to
It's
get.
not stewardship. It's not.
It is difficult to get them to articulate that it will look like a natural forest, and that it's a very incremental It's very incremental, but I do think there is progress. I actually don't want to put you on the spot, Andrea, but I do. This is Andrea Tuttle in this case. I do think that the challenge of requiring this kind of management is really difficult in the public space. And I think it's actually a role that private conservation can play. And then with the example of how profitable it can be in multiple ways, that you pull people to that example, even while you seek to improve the regulatory floor. But Andy, would you be willing to, as I said, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you're open to saying anything here, I welcome it.
Well, sure, and Richard's been at this even longer than I have, dealing with the Forest Practice Act and the slow incremental improvement of forest practices. But, finally you get old enough and you actually can look back and see progress in state regulation. We have the acute fights over forest practices are not as intense as they used to be. We are doing better. Yes, we have industrial forest management, and they're under the same economic pressures that for net value and driving their profit cycle. But nevertheless, we have better stream zones. We have better retention of certain habitat types. No, it's not the model that PFT is demonstrating here. But I don't want to not acknowledge the progress that has been made. There's always hope to force government agencies to do better. Frankly, my best optimism is on the federal side, where I just gave a talk on the climate policies under the new Biden administration, and they are just breathtaking compared to what we've faced for the last forever, and certainly the last 4 years. But the progress on recognizing climate change and the need for policy drivers and real investments is where I take a lot of encouragement. So Richard, you've been at this. I encourage you to keep saying what you say, but I think it's right that we can show these models like Van Eck. There are others. There are, PFT has a number of owners that now have PFT working forest easements, and other land conservation groups have similar terms. And so we can see private landowners being able to be rewarded for these extra conservation measures that they take upon themselves. And in part, it's because they love their land. They want to pass on they have their own personal land ethic, and they want to pass that on to their family and to future generations. So I take heart in those private actions too.
Can I just add one other thing, Richard?
I agree with that, but on the other hand, like in Jackson Demonstration State Forest now, all of a sudden there's a bunch of harvest plans. It seems that they're trying to take away the interesting luxury of large trees on Jackson. It's not nurturing the large trees like Laurie described for their carbon sequestration capabilities. There needs to be a real relook at all this. I appreciate your compliments, Andrea, but I'm very angry.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I want to echo what Andrea said, which is that you are a champion, and you have driven changes in the Forest Practice Act through your insistence and smarts and passion. And that's something that is a huge legacy. I also want to point out your element here of identifying that there has been an appropriation of the word sequestration, which we all associate with forests, to geologic sequestration, which is pumping CO2 in the ground in order to enhance oil recovery from depleted oil wells primarily. There may be other forms of geologic sequestration, but that is the dominant one. And there is a big push to subsidize the development of that technology because there is this feeling that we have to do more to take CO2 out of the atmosphere than what, for example, forests will do. And while that may be true, if we were to implement all the low-hanging fruit that we have in climate action, in terms of transforming the way we manage land, in terms of transforming our energy utilization and development, in terms of transforming our transportation sector, that might not be the case. So I think that, and that technology is decades off. It's over $800 a ton theoretically in theoretical prices to do injection of CO2 into depleted oil wells. And then what do you do with the oil that's been pumped out of those wells after you've recovered it? They're not going to pump it back down again. I mean, there is a real appropriation of this notion of sequestration technology to support what would then be proprietary technologies that certainly from an investment perspective would be very lucrative to the people who invested in them. Whereas natural sequestration isn't proprietary. We all can do it, and we can do it on as small as well as larger parcels. So I think you have identified an issue there that is a real issue. And it is one that the Western States Petroleum Association has been actively lobbying for and unapologetically lobbying for. That's their business. So I think that's an important point.
Right. Thank you, Richard, for your question. I'm sorry, Richard, it's really hard to hear your audio, but if you'd like to use the chat function to connect with Laurie for some further questions, I do have a few more questions to get through. And I really do appreciate your input and questions, very, very important. But the next question I wanted to address was, do you utilize any controlled burning in parts to maintain your forests or the Van Eck?
That is something that we're actively looking at. And fire is a natural part of the redwood forest ecosystem. The challenge that we have is that is a couple. One is that there are quite a few residences near the Van Eck, and there's a lot of fear about fire. But there is now, of course, a Humboldt County Burn Council, and there's going to be quite a bit more money to do prescribed burns. That could be a really useful tool in decreasing the spruce component. For example, in the Fieldbrook tract, spruce has a very thin bark. It would naturally be disfavored by a natural fire regime. It's not, redwoods are not a frequent fire system. The forests that we manage in the mixed conifer are often frequent fire systems. So the amount of controlled burn that you would do is very different. And one of the things I want to point out is there's a difference between controlled or prescribed burning and cultural burning often, because control and prescribed burnings are really to reduce fuels, largely with a safety element. And cultural fire really has a broader impact. And in the redwood region, cultural fire was often encouraged in order to maintain the native grasses, and in some areas, the oak components. So I think controlled burn is, and cultural fire, both prescribed and cultural fire, are really important tools. They're ones that PFT has been actively promoting at the state level. And it is a really critical reason I'm so pleased with the new emergency funding of $536 million in the early action budget, because a lot of that will go to setting up and enabling burns. We've also worked hard to increase the number of burn crews and burn bosses and improve the liability coverage for those who do burns, because one of the many private landowners are interested in doing burns, but they don't want to get sued if a fire should get out of control. And so there's been change in the liability and in the negligence standard, so that if you've been doing a burn that has been licensed and you have a licensed crew doing it, then you will not be liable as long as you followed that permit. That's incredibly important because, if you think about California, it's a fire adapted state. It's fire adapted. It's not a fire adapted state, but its natural systems are fire adapted. And what we need to be doing is managing to get back to being able to tolerate that. And one of the things I want to underscore with that, and I realize we're almost out of time, but it's really important to recognize that California's forests were accreting carbon under that natural fire regime. Our grasslands were accreting carbon under that fire regime. We had much better control of pests and diseases with that fire regime. This is something where we shouldn't be looking at fire as, oh my goodness, that's a huge release of CO2 to the atmosphere, because in fact, it actually is remineralizing the soil and fertilizing the soil naturally in many cases, as well as getting rid of competition. So it's a really important tool to get back on the landscape. And while it isn't that big of a feature in the redwood region, it is a really big feature in other forest types, and it's one we need to do more of.
Another question probably on a lot of people's minds are when are we able to take a tour of the forest, and could you lead us?
Well, as soon as it's safe for people to be out, we're happy to do that. And if I can join it, I'd love to, but we also have some really wonderful staff who can do that. And in fact, Carol and CJ met one of those staff, a young man named Jack Singer. And Jack is going to eagerly volunteer to help lead a tour, maybe this fall, depending upon how everything shakes out. But we do want to be respectful of while things are getting better with the COVID situation right now, we aren't over the hump quite yet with that, but we'd love to do that.
All right, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
All right, Hunter Harrell asks, will you potentially be harvesting even larger trees in the long-term future, or will revenue shift to carbon? If you do harvest old growth size trees, where will the people with the skills and equipment to harvest those trees come from? And what mills can handle those size trees?
It's a couple hundred years out before I think we'd be in the situation where we're really facing that question. But the questions underneath it are really good ones in terms of the social and physical infrastructure to support timber-based forest management and forest management in a larger context. Because, so for example, we are working to restore a natural stream channel on our Field Brook and Lindsay Creek tracks. That's part of forest management because the streams are part of the forest, right? We're interested in re-daylighting, re-unearthing upper portions of Lindsay Creek that have been silted in due to the amount of timber harvest that's been done and the erosion acceleration that's happened over the past 150 years. That's part of forest management. It's managing for the forest. Many of you will have known the name of Jerry Franklin, or do know the name of Jerry Franklin, as just a preeminent forest ecologist and silviculturalist. And we were out on the Van Eck, and I was pushing him really hard to say, so what are the metrics that we know we're really making progress? And after a while, he's kind of stood back and said, well, the highest measure of a forest function is its watershed function. So thinking about forest management is thinking about managing for all these factors. So we'll be doing forest management. We're going to need the people who can run the machines to do the work in the forest. And that means they need to know they have long-term employment. And part of what we are about is re-engaging with forests writ large. And that means making sure that there's the kind of money to manage for forests in all their system values that will attract young people into these professions. Because there has been a flight from people going into forestry as it's been traditionally constructed. There are not that many young people who want to be loggers or equipment operators. It's dangerous, it's hard work, and they may not enjoy it in the long term. It's hard on your body. So we need to have more consistent employment to pull people that way with good working conditions. And that means keeping people employed in forests for a variety of forest outcomes, including but not limited to timber. So I hope that somewhat answers that question. In other words, yes, we're very interested in the human infrastructure that should be supporting the natural infrastructure so that the natural infrastructure supports us.
Well, Laurie, you have a great way of putting words together on all kinds of topics. So, Andrea, was that really the last question?
I did have one more question from Russell Kramer. Have you been able to fetch better prices for your high quality large wood with good heartwood? Or do you get the same price as for a 40 to 60-year-old logs?
Our larger logs have a higher stumpage value than our small logs do. So there is, there is a premium there for the large logs in most years, not in every year. Some years it's when the markets are down, that's not the case, but in general, we get better pricing for that. We also get some of the mill owners come who take the large logs, even if they're not going to buy them because they enjoy looking at the big trees.
Okay, I think people are still here, Laurie, and I suppose you could go on forever, but that's not a good policy. I think if everybody can clap or press the right button or something to tell Laurie, thank you for a very interesting evening, leaves us with plenty to think about, plenty of questions, but I think you've really touched a lot of people, and we thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, and we'll welcome you out on the forest, I hope later this year.
Yes, we want to get there. We'll be in touch.
Okay. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. Have a great month. We'll see you in May to hear about serpentine plants in Southwest Oregon.